The Little Peasant. There was a village where only rich farmers lived, except for one poor man whom they called the Little Peasant, Burley. He didn't even have a cow and had even less money to buy one, though he and his wife dearly wished to own one. One day he said to her, "Listen, I have a good idea. Our neighbor, the carpenter, can make us a calf out of wood and paint it brown so that it looks like a real one. Over time, it will grow and become a cow." The wife liked the idea as well, and the neighbor, the carpenter, made and shaped the calf, painted it as it should be, and crafted it so that its head was bent down as if it were eating. The next morning, when the cows were driven out, the little peasant called the herdsman over and said, "Look, I have a little calf here, but it is still small and needs to be carried." The herdsman agreed, picked it up in his arms, carried it out to the pasture, and set it down in the grass. The calf always stood there as if it were eating, and the herdsman said, "It will soon walk on its own. Just look at how it eats already." In the evening, when he was driving the herd back home, he said to the calf, "If you can stand there and eat your fill, you can also walk on your four legs. I don't care to carry you home again in my arms." But the little peasant stood by his door, waiting for his little calf. When the herdsman drove the cows through the village and the calf was missing, the little peasant asked about it. The herdsman replied, "It is still standing out there eating. It wouldn't stop and come with us." The little peasant insisted, "Oh no, I must have my animal back." So they went back to the meadow together, but someone had stolen the calf and it was gone. The herdsman said, "It must have run away." The little peasant, however, said, "Don't tell me that," and took the herdsman before the mayor. For his negligence, the mayor condemned the herdsman to give the little peasant a cow for the calf that had gone missing. Now the little peasant and his wife had the long-desired cow. They were overjoyed but had no food to give it, so it soon had to be slaughtered. They salted the meat, and the little peasant went into town, hoping to sell the skin to buy a new calf with the proceeds. On the way, he passed by a mill where a raven with broken wings was sitting. Out of pity, he picked it up and wrapped it in the cow's skin. As the weather turned foul with storm and rain, he could go no further and sought shelter at the mill. The miller's wife was alone at home and told the little peasant, "Lie down on the straw," and gave him a piece of cheese bread. The little peasant ate it, lay down with the skin beside him, and the woman thought, "He is tired and has gone to sleep." In the meantime, the parson arrived. The miller's wife welcomed him warmly and said, "My husband is out, so we will have a feast." The little peasant listened and was annoyed that he had had to make do with cheese bread while they prepared to feast. The woman served 4 different dishes: roast meat, salad, cakes, and wine. Just as they were about to sit down and eat, there was a knock outside. The woman exclaimed, "Oh God, it's my husband!" She quickly hid the roast meat inside the tiled stove, the wine under the pillow, the salad on the bed, the cakes under it, and the parson in the cupboard in the entrance. Then she opened the door for her husband and said, "Thank heavens you are back. What a storm! It looks as if the world is coming to an end." The miller saw the little peasant lying on the straw and asked, "What is that fellow doing here?" "Oh," said the wife, "the poor wretch came in the storm and rain and begged for shelter, so I gave him a piece of cheese bread and showed him to the straw." The husband said, "I have no objection, but get me something to eat quickly." The wife said, "But I have nothing but cheese bread." "I'm content with anything," replied the husband. "Cheese bread will do." Then he looked at the little peasant and said, "Come and eat some more with me." The little peasant didn't need a second invitation and got up to eat. Afterwards, the miller saw the skin in which the raven was wrapped lying on the ground and asked, "What do you have there?" The little peasant replied, "I have a fortune teller in it." "Can he foretell something for me?" asked the miller. "Why not?" replied the little peasant, "but he only tells 4 things, and the 5th he keeps to himself." The miller was curious and said, "Let him foretell something for once." The little peasant squeezed the raven's head so that it croaked and made a sound like "Krr." The miller asked, "What did he say?" The little peasant replied, "First, he says that there is wine hidden under the pillow." "Good heavens!" exclaimed the miller, "went there and found the wine." "Now go on," said the miller. The little peasant made the raven croak again and said, Secondly, he says that there is roast meat in the tiled stove. Good heavens, cried the miller, went there, and found the roast meat. The little peasant made the raven prophesy further and said, Thirdly, he says that there is salad on the bed. Good heavens, cried the miller, went there, and found the salad. Finally, the little peasant squeezed the raven again until it croaked loudly and said, Fourthly, he says that there are cakes under the bed. Good heavens, cried the miller, went there, and found the cakes. The two men sat together at the table, but the miller's wife was in a state of panic. She went to bed and took all the keys with her. The miller was curious to know the fifth prophecy, but the little peasant said, First, let's calmly eat the four other things, because the fifth one is something dreadful. So they ate, and then they negotiated over how much the miller should pay for the fifth prophecy until they agreed on 300 thalers. The little peasant then pressed the raven's head once more, making it croak loudly. The miller asked, What did it say? The little peasant replied, It said that outside in the cupboard in the entrance, the devil is hiding. The miller exclaimed, The devil must go out, and opened the house door, but the wife had to hand over the key, and the little peasant unlocked the cupboard. Out ran the parson as fast as he could, and the miller said, I saw the black fellow with my own eyes. It was indeed true. The next morning, the little peasant slipped away at dawn with the 300 thalers. When the little peasant returned home, he gradually began to prosper. He built a nice house, and the farmers in the village said the little peasant must have been to where the golden snow falls and where people bring money home by the shovelful. The little peasant was summoned before the mayor and asked to explain the source of his newfound wealth. He replied, I sold my cowhide in town for 300 thalers. When the farmers heard this, they all wanted to enjoy the same great profit. They went home, killed all their cows, and skinned them, intending to sell the hides in town for a large profit. The mayor said, But my maid must go first. When she went to the merchant in town, he gave her no more than 3 thalers for a hide. And when the others came, he gave them even less and said, What should I do with all these hides? The farmers were furious at being duped by the little peasant and sought revenge. They accused him of fraud before the mayor, and the innocent little peasant was unanimously condemned to death. He was to be rolled into the water in a barrel full of holes. The little peasant was brought out, and a priest was called to give him a final blessing. Everyone else was made to leave, and when the little peasant looked at the priest, he recognized him as the parson who had been with the miller's wife. The little peasant said to him, I freed you from the cupboard. Now free me from this barrel. Just then, a shepherd came by with a flock of sheep. The little peasant knew that the shepherd had long wished to become mayor, so he shouted with all his might, No, I won't do it. Even if the whole world wanted it, no, I won't do it. The shepherd, hearing this, approached and asked, What is it you don't want to do? The little peasant replied, They want to make me mayor if I get into this barrel, but I won't do it. The shepherd said, If that's all it takes to become mayor, I'd gladly get into the barrel. The little peasant said, If you get in, you will become mayor. The shepherd was pleased with this, got into the barrel, and the little peasant fastened the lid. Then the little peasant took the shepherd's flock and drove them away. The parson went to the community and said the last rites had been given. They came and rolled the barrel towards the water. As the barrel began to roll, the shepherd inside cried out, I'm willing to be mayor. They thought it was the little peasant shouting and said, So do we, but you must first take a look around down there. And they rolled the barrel into the water. Afterwards, the farmers went home. As they were returning to the village, they saw the little peasant coming, driving a flock of sheep quietly and looking completely content. The farmers were astonished and asked, Little peasant, where do you come from? Have you come out of the water? Of course, replied the little peasant. I sank deep, deep until I finally reached the bottom. I pushed out the bottom of the barrel and crawled out. There were beautiful meadows there with many lambs grazing. I brought back this flock with me. The farmers asked, Are there still more down there? Oh yes, said the little peasant, more than you could ever need. The farmers then agreed that they too wanted to fetch flocks of sheep, each of them. The mayor said, I will go first. They all went together to the water, where they saw little fluffy clouds in the blue sky reflected in the water, which looked like lambs. They shouted, "We can already see the sheep at the bottom." The mayor stepped forward and said, "I will go down first to take a look. If it's good, I'll call you." He jumped in, and splash, he went into the water. The others thought he was calling them, and all hurriedly jumped in after him. Thus, the village was emptied, and the little peasant became the sole heir and a wealthy man. The Queen Bee. Once upon a time, two kings' sons set out to seek adventures and fell into a wild, reckless way of living, so that they never returned home. Their youngest brother, called Dummling, Simpleton, went out to find his brothers. When he finally found them, they mocked him, saying that with his simplicity, he expected to make his way in the world, while they, who were much smarter, could not succeed. The three brothers continued their journey together until they came to an ant hill. The two eldest wanted to stir it up to see the little ants scurry around in fright and carry off their eggs, but Dummling said, "Leave the creatures in peace. I will not let you disturb them." They went on until they came to a lake where many ducks were swimming. The two brothers wanted to catch a couple and roast them, but Dummling would not allow it, saying, "Leave the creatures in peace. I will not let you kill them." Finally, they came to a bee's nest in a tree, overflowing with honey running down the trunk. The two brothers wanted to light a fire under the tree to smoke out the bees and take the honey, but Dummling stopped them again, saying, "Leave the creatures in peace. I will not let you burn them." At last, the three brothers came to a castle, where in the stables stood horses of stone. No one was to be seen, and they walked through all the halls until they came to a door at the far end, secured with three locks. In the middle of the door was a small opening through which they could look into the room. There, they saw a little gray man sitting at a table. They called to him once, twice, but he did not hear. Only on the third call did he get up, unlock the door, and come out. Without saying a word, he led them to a table laden with food and drink. After they had eaten and drunk, he showed each of them to their own sleeping chamber. The next morning, the little gray man came to the eldest brother, beckoned him, and led him to a stone table on which were inscribed 3 tasks to break the enchantment of the castle. The first task was to collect the princess's pearls, 1,000 of them, from under the moss in the forest. If the task was not completed by sunset, and even one pearl was missing, the seeker would be turned to stone. The eldest brother went out and searched all day, but by the end of the day he had only found 100 pearls. As foretold, he was turned into stone. The next day, the second brother took up the challenge. He fared no better, finding only 200 pearls, and he too was turned to stone. Finally, it was Dumling's turn. He searched in the moss, but it was such a tedious task that he grew discouraged and sat down on a stone to weep. As he sat there, the Ant King, whose life Dummling had once saved, appeared with 5,000 ants. It did not take long for the little creatures to gather all the pearls and pile them up. The second task was to retrieve the key to the princess's sleeping chamber from the lake. When Dummling reached the lake, the ducks he had saved came swimming, dived below, and brought up the key from the depths. The third task was the hardest, to choose the youngest and loveliest of the 3 sleeping princesses. They were identical in appearance and could only be distinguished by the different sweets they had eaten before they fell asleep. The eldest had eaten a piece of sugar, the second a little syrup, and the youngest a spoonful of honey. Then the queen bee, whom Dummling had protected from the fire, arrived and tested the lips of all 3 princesses. She settled on the lips of the one who had eaten honey, and thus the prince knew which one to choose. With this, the spell was broken. Everyone awoke from their stony sleep and regained their true forms. Dummling married the youngest and loveliest princess and became king after her father's death. His 2 brothers married the other 2 princesses. The 3 Feathers. Translated from the German. There was once a king who had 3 sons. 2 of them were clever and wise, but the third son did not speak much, was simple, and was known as the simpleton. When the king grew old and weak and thought of his end, he didn't know which of his sons should inherit the kingdom after him. So he said to them, "Go forth, and whoever brings me the finest carpet shall be king after my death." To prevent any quarrels, he took them outside his castle, blew 3 feathers into the air, and said, "You shall go as they fly." One feather flew to the east, another to the west, but the third flew straight up and soon fell to the ground. One brother went to the right, the other to the left, and they mocked Simpleton, who had to stay where the third feather had fallen. Simpleton sat down, feeling sad. Then, all at once, he noticed a trap door next to the feather. He lifted it, found a staircase, and went down. There he came to another door, knocked on it, and heard a voice from inside. "Little green maiden small, hopping, hopping hither and thither, hop to the door, and quickly see who is there." The door opened, and he saw a large fat toad sitting there, surrounded by many smaller toads. The fat toad asked what he wanted. He answered, "I would like to have the most beautiful and finest carpet." Then she called to a young toad and said, "Little green maiden small, hopping, hopping hither and thither, hop quickly and bring me the great box here." The young toad fetched the box, and the fat toad opened it and gave Simpleton a carpet so beautiful and fine that none above on earth could have woven such a thing. Simpleton thanked her and went back up. The 2 older brothers had not taken their youngest brother seriously and thought he would find nothing. "Why should we bother searching much?" they said, and took coarse cloths from the first shepherds' wives they met and brought them back to the king. Simpleton also returned at the same time and brought his beautiful carpet. When the king saw it, he was astonished and said, "If fairness is to be observed, the kingdom belongs to the youngest." But the 2 older brothers gave their father no peace and argued that Simpleton, who lacked understanding in everything, could not possibly be king, and they pleaded with him to set another challenge. So the father said, "He who brings me the most beautiful ring shall inherit the kingdom." He led the 3 brothers outside again and blew 3 feathers into the air, which they were to follow. The feathers of the 2 eldest again flew east and west, while Simpleton's feather flew straight up and fell near the trapdoor in the ground. Simpleton went down again to the fat toad and told her that he needed the most beautiful ring. She had her great box fetched and gave him a ring from it that sparkled with jewels and was so beautiful that no goldsmith on earth could have made it. The 2 eldest laughed at Simpleton for going to seek a golden ring and put no effort into the task. Instead, they pulled the nails out of an old carriage ring and brought it to the king. But when Simpleton presented his golden ring, his father declared again, "The kingdom belongs to him." The 2 eldest didn't stop pestering the king until he made a third challenge and declared that the one who brought home the most beautiful woman would inherit the kingdom. He blew the 3 feathers into the air once more, and they flew as before. Simpleton went directly down to the fat toad and said, "I am to bring home the most beautiful woman." "Oh," replied the toad, "the most beautiful woman. She is not at hand at the moment, but still, you shall have her." She gave him a hollowed yellow turnip with 6 mice harnessed to it. Simpleton said sorrowfully, "What am I to do with this?" The toad answered, "Just put one of my little toads into it." He picked one at random from the circle and placed her into the yellow coach. No sooner was she seated inside than she turned into a wonderfully beautiful maiden, the turnip into a coach, and the 6 mice into horses. He kissed her, quickly drove off with the horses, and took her to the king. His brothers arrived later, having made no effort to find beautiful women, but had brought the first peasant women they chanced to meet. When the king saw them, he said, "After my death, the kingdom belongs to my youngest son." But the 2 eldest deafened the king's ears again with their clamor, "We cannot agree that Simpleton should be king," and demanded that the one whose wife could leap through a ring hanging in the center of the hall should have the preference. They thought, "The peasant women can do that easily. They are strong enough, but the delicate maiden will jump herself to death." The old king agreed to this. The 2 peasant women jumped and managed to leap through the ring, but they were so clumsy that they fell and broke their rough arms and legs. Then the beautiful maiden that Simpleton had brought sprang lightly through the ring like a deer, and all opposition had to cease. Thus, Simpleton received the crown and ruled wisely for many years. The Golden Goose. There was a man who had 3 sons, the youngest of whom was called the Simpleton, and he was despised and mocked and always treated unfairly. One day, the eldest son wanted to go into the forest to cut wood, and before he left, his mother gave him a nice fine pancake and a bottle of wine so that he wouldn't suffer from hunger or thirst. When he came into the forest, an old gray man met him, greeted him, and said, "Give me a piece of your cake from your pocket, and let me have a sip of your wine. I am so hungry and thirsty." But the prudent son replied, "If I give you my cake and my wine, I will have nothing left for myself. Be off with you," and left the old man standing there and went on his way. As he began to cut down a tree, it wasn't long before he made a wrong stroke, and the axe struck him in the arm so that he had to go home and have it bandaged. This had been caused by the little gray man. After that, the second son went into the forest, and his mother gave him, as she had given the eldest, a pancake and a bottle of wine. The old gray man met him as well and asked for a piece of cake and a sip of wine. But the second son also replied wisely, "If I give you anything, it will be at my own expense, so be off with you," and left the old man standing there and went on his way. The punishment followed. After he had struck the tree a few times, he hit himself in the leg so badly that he had to be carried home. Then the simpleton said, "Father, let me go into the forest to cut wood." The father answered, "Your brothers have hurt themselves doing that. Leave it alone, you don't understand anything about it." But the simpleton begged so long that at last the father said, "Well, off you go. You will only learn through experience." The mother gave him a cake, which was made with water and baked in the ashes, and a bottle of sour beer. When he came into the forest, the old gray man met him as well, greeted him, and said, "Give me a piece of your cake and a drink from your bottle. I am so hungry and thirsty." The simpleton replied, "I only have ash cake and sour beer, but if that's good enough for you, let's sit down and eat." So they sat down, and as the simpleton took out his ash cake, it turned into a fine pancake, and the sour beer became good wine. They ate and drank, and afterwards the little man said, "Because you have a good heart and are willing to share what you have, I will grant you good luck. Over there stands an old tree. Cut it down, and at its roots you will find something." Then the little man took his leave. The simpleton went there and cut down the tree, and when it fell, he saw, sitting among the roots, a goose with feathers of pure gold. He lifted it out, took it with him, and went to an inn where he intended to stay the night. The innkeeper had 3 daughters, who, when they saw the goose, were curious to know what kind of wonderful bird it was, and each longed to have one of its golden feathers. The eldest thought, "I will wait for a good opportunity to pluck out one of its feathers for myself." When the simpleton went out, she grabbed the goose by its wing, but her fingers and hands stuck fast to it. Soon after, the second sister came with the same idea of getting a golden feather. But as soon as she touched her sister, she too was stuck fast. Finally, the third sister came with the same intention. The others cried out, "Stay away, for heaven's sake, stay away." But she didn't see why she should stay away, and thought, "If they are doing it, why shouldn't I?" and went to them. But when she touched her sisters, she got stuck too. And so they had to stay all night attached to the goose. The next morning, the simpleton took the goose under his arm and went away, unmindful of the 3 girls who were hanging on to it. They had to run after him, left and right, wherever his legs took him. In the middle of the field, they met the parson, who, seeing the strange procession, said, "Shame on you girls, running after a young fellow through the field like this." He grabbed the youngest by the hand to pull her away, but as soon as he touched her, he too was stuck fast and had to follow on. Soon after, the sexton came by, and seeing the parson following behind the 3 girls, he called out, "Ho, your reverence! Where are you off to in such a hurry? Don't forget we have a christening today," and grabbed the parson by his sleeve. But he too got stuck and had to follow on. As the 5 of them tramped on, one after another, 2 peasants with their hoes came from the fields. The parson cried out to them and begged them to help free him and the sexton, but as soon as they touched the sexton, they too were stuck and had to follow on. And now there were 7 people trailing after the simpleton and the goose. He then came to a city where a king ruled. who had a daughter so serious that no one could make her laugh. Therefore, he had decreed a law that whoever could make her laugh would marry her. The simpleton, upon hearing this, went with his goose and its companions before the king's daughter. When she saw the 7 people trailing one after another, she burst out laughing loudly and couldn't stop. The simpleton demanded her hand in marriage, but the king did not like the prospective son-in-law. He raised objections and said he must first bring him a man who could drink a cellar full of wine. The simpleton thought of the little gray man who could surely help him. He went out into the forest, and at the spot where he had cut down the tree, he saw a man sitting who looked very sad. The simpleton asked him what was troubling him so much. The man replied, "I am so thirsty and cannot quench it. I cannot bear cold water. I emptied a barrel of wine, but what is a drop on a hot stone?" "I can help you with that," said the simpleton. "Come with me, you shall have your fill." He led him to the king's cellar, and the man set to work on the large barrels, drinking and drinking until his hips hurt, and before a day had passed, he had drunk the entire cellar dry. The simpleton again demanded his bride, but the king was angered that a poor boy, whom everyone called a simpleton, should carry off his daughter, and set new conditions. He must first find a man who could eat a mountain of bread. The simpleton did not hesitate long, but went straight out into the forest. There sat on the same spot a man who was lacing himself up with a strap, making a grim face, and said, "I have eaten an entire oven full of coarse breadcrumbs. But what good is that when one is as hungry as I am? My stomach remains empty, and I must keep tightening my belt if I am not to die of hunger." The simpleton was pleased with this and said, "Get up and come with me. You shall eat your fill." He led him to the king's court, who had gathered all the flour from the entire kingdom and baked an enormous mountain of it. But the man from the forest stood before it, began to eat, and in one day the entire mountain had disappeared. The simpleton demanded his bride for the 3rd time, but the king sought another excuse and demanded a ship that could sail on land and water. "But as soon as you arrive with it," he said, "you shall at once have my daughter as your wife." The simpleton went straight into the forest, where the old gray man sat, to whom he had given his cake, and said, "I have drunk and eaten for you, and now I want to give you a ship. I will do all this because you have been merciful to me." Then he gave him the ship that could sail on land and water. And when the king saw this, he could no longer withhold his daughter from him. The wedding was celebrated, and after the king's death, the simpleton inherited the kingdom and lived happily for a long time with his wife. All Kinds of Fur, Allerlau, a fairy tale by the brothers Grimm. Once upon a time, there was a king who had a wife with golden hair, so beautiful that there was no one like her on earth. One day, she fell ill, and sensing her impending death, she called the king to her side. "If you wish to marry again after I am gone," she said, "promise me that you will only marry someone as beautiful as I am, with hair as golden as mine." The king solemnly agreed, and shortly after, she closed her eyes and passed away. For a long time, the king mourned deeply and had no thought of remarrying. Eventually, his advisors urged him, "Your Majesty, the kingdom needs a queen. We must find someone who matches the beauty of the late queen." Messengers were sent far and wide to find such a bride, but none could be found who matched her beauty or her golden hair. Disheartened, the messengers returned empty-handed. Now, the king had a daughter, equally as beautiful as her late mother, with the same golden hair. As she grew up, the king noticed how much she resembled her mother and found himself falling in love with her. He then declared to his advisors, "I will marry my daughter, for she is the very image of my late wife. There is no other bride who can compare." The advisors were shocked and protested, "Such a thing is forbidden. It is a crime against nature, and it will bring ruin upon the kingdom." The daughter was horrified when she learned of her father's intentions, but hoped to dissuade him. She presented him with a seemingly impossible task, saying, "Before I agree to your wish, I must have 3 dresses, one as golden as the sun, one as silvery as the moon, and one as radiant as the stars. In addition, I require a mantle made from 1,000 different kinds of fur and hair, each contributed by a different animal in the kingdom." She thought, "This will surely divert my father from his wicked plan." However, the king was undeterred. The cleverest maidens were set to work weaving the dresses of sun, moon, and stars, while the huntsmen gathered pieces of fur from every animal in the kingdom to make the mantle. When everything was prepared, the king presented the mantle to his daughter and announced, "The wedding will be tomorrow." Upon realizing that she could not change her father's heart, the daughter decided to flee. In the dead of night, she gathered 3 precious items from her treasures: a golden ring, a golden spinning wheel, and a golden reel. She packed the dresses of sun, moon, and stars into a nutshell, donned the mantle of all kinds of fur, and covered her face and hands with soot. Entrusting herself to God, she fled the palace and walked through the night until she reached a vast forest. Exhausted, she found shelter in a hollow tree and fell asleep. As the sun rose, she continued to sleep, unaware that it was day. Meanwhile, the king who owned the forest was out hunting. When his dogs reached the tree, they sniffed and barked excitedly. The king ordered his huntsmen to investigate, and they returned, saying, "A strange creature lies asleep in the hollow tree. Its skin is made of 1,000 different kinds of fur, like none we have ever seen before." Intrigued, the king commanded, "Capture it alive and bring it to me." When the huntsman approached the maiden, she woke in terror and pleaded, "I am a poor child, abandoned by my father and mother. Have mercy on me and take me with you." The huntsman agreed, saying, "All kinds of fur. You can work in the kitchen and sweep the hearth." They brought her back to the royal palace and assigned her a dark closet under the stairs, where no light entered, saying, "Furry creature, this is where you will live and sleep." Thus, all kinds of fur lived in the palace, enduring hardship. "Oh, fair princess, what will become of you now?" It happened one day that a feast was held in the palace, and she asked the cook, "May I go upstairs for a while and watch? I will stand outside the door." The cook agreed, with the condition that she return in half an hour to sweep the hearth. All kinds of fur took her oil lamp, returned to her hiding place, removed her fur dress, washed away the soot from her face and hands, revealing her full beauty once more. She took out the dresses that shone like the sun, moon, and stars, and went to the feast. Everyone made way for her, believing her to be a princess. The king approached her, took her hand, danced with her, and thought, "Never have my eyes seen anyone so beautiful." After the dance, she curtsied, but when the king looked around, she had vanished, and no one knew where she had gone. The palace guards were summoned, but none had seen her. All kinds of fur had hurried back to her den, quickly changed back into her rough attire, blackened her face and hands again, and put on the fur mantle. When she returned to the kitchen to sweep the hearth, the cook said, "Leave that until morning and prepare the soup for the king. I, too, will go upstairs for a while, but don't let any hair fall into the soup, or you'll go hungry in the future." So the cook departed, and all kinds of fur made the soup for the king, preparing a bread soup as best she could. When it was ready, she placed her golden ring in the bowl. The king enjoyed the soup so much that he proclaimed it the best he had ever tasted. However, when he reached the bottom of the bowl, he found a golden ring and wondered how it had gotten there. He summoned the cook and asked who had made the soup. The cook falsely claimed responsibility, but the king knew better. "It was cooked differently and much better than your usual," he said. The cook confessed, "I did not make it. It was the rough animal." The king ordered, "Go and bring her here." When all kinds of fur came, the king asked, "Who are you?" She replied, "I am a poor girl who no longer has any father or mother." He pressed on, "What purpose do you serve in my palace?" She answered, "I am good for nothing but to have boots thrown at my head." He persisted, "Where did you get the ring that was in the soup?" She replied, "I know nothing about the ring." Thus, the king learned nothing and had to send her away once more. Some time later, another festival was held, and as before, all kinds of fur asked the cook for permission to observe. He agreed, saying, "Yes, but return in half an hour and make the king the bread soup he enjoys so much." She quickly washed herself in her den, took out the dress as silvery as the moon from the nut, and put it on. She appeared in the hall like a princess, and the king approached her joyfully, pleased to see her again. They danced together, and when the dance ended, she vanished so swiftly that the king could not see where she had gone. She returned to her den, transformed back into a furry animal, and went to the kitchen to prepare the bread soup. When the cook went upstairs, she placed her little golden spinning wheel in the bowl so that it was covered by the soup. The king ate it and enjoyed it as much as before. The cook was brought before the king and again admitted that All Kinds of Fur had prepared the soup. All Kinds of Fur appeared before the king once more, claiming she was only good for having boots thrown at her head and knew nothing about the golden spinning wheel. When the king held a third festival, everything unfolded as before. The cook said, "By my faith, Rough Skin, you are a witch who always puts something in the soup that makes it so delicious, the king prefers it to mine." Despite his suspicions, he allowed her to go upstairs at the appointed time. This time, she put on the dress that shone like the stars and entered the hall. Once again, the king danced with the beautiful maiden and thought she had never looked more beautiful. While they danced, he managed to slip a golden ring onto her finger without her noticing. He arranged for the dance to last a long time. When it ended, he tried to hold her by the hands, but she broke free and disappeared quickly through the crowd, vanishing from sight. She hurried back to her den under the stairs, but had stayed too long. She couldn't remove her pretty dress, only covering it with her fur mantle. In her haste, she didn't completely blacken herself, leaving one finger white. All Kinds of Fur went to the kitchen and made the bread soup for the king, adding her golden reel while the cook was away. When the king found the reel at the bottom of the soup, he summoned All Kinds of Fur. Spotting the white finger, he saw the ring he had slipped on during the dance. He grabbed her hand and held her firmly. When she tried to escape and run away, her fur mantle opened slightly, revealing the starry dress beneath. The king seized the mantle and tore it off. Her golden hair gleamed, and she stood there in full splendor, unable to hide any longer. After washing away the soot and ashes from her face, she was more beautiful than anyone ever seen on earth. The king declared, "You are my beloved bride, and we will never part again." They were married and they lived happily ever after.